What if I told you that more than 4,000 years ago, a civilization rose from the desert, built mountains out of stone, ruled in the name of gods, and mastered life, death, and eternity before most of the world had even learned to write? This is not just the story of pyramids, this is the story of power so absolute it called itself divine. Of rulers who believed they controlled the rising of the sun, of an empire that shaped history long before the Roman Empire ever existed. Tonight, we journey to the banks of the Nile, into ambition, faith, war, mystery, and immortality. Stay with me because Egypt's ancient empire is not what you think it is. We'll explain everything in this video step by step, don't skip it. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon of northeastern Africa. The sky blushes gold, the desert is silent, and then, like a living artery cutting through the barren earth, the Nile begins to shimmer beneath the rising sun. It was here, along the banks of that patient, generous river, that one of humanity's greatest experiments began. More than 5,000 years ago, long before the rise of Roman Empire, before the philosophers of Greece questioned the heavens, before the legions marched, there was Egypt. Not merely a kingdom, but an idea. An audacious belief that order could be drawn from chaos, that permanence could be carved from stone, that human life, fleeting and fragile, could touch eternity. The ancient Egyptians called their land Kemet, the Black Land, after the rich, dark soil left behind by the Nile's annual flood. Each year, the river rose and receded, like the steady breathing of a god. And with each flood, it renewed the earth. Crops flourished, communities grew, and gradually, small villages merged into a unified state under a single ruler. Tradition tells us that around 3100 BCE, a king known as Narmer, sometimes identified as Menes, united Upper and Lower Egypt. It was more than a political act. It was the birth of a civilization that would endure, in various forms, for 3 millennia. And at the center of that civilization stood the Pharaoh. To modern eyes, the Pharaoh may seem like a distant monarch draped in gold and ritual, but to the ancient Egyptians, the Pharaoh was the living embodiment of divine order, Ma'at. He was not simply a ruler, he was the guardian of balance between earth and sky, humanity and the gods, life and death. This belief shaped everything. It shaped the massive stones hauled across sand and riverbanks to build monuments that still defy our imagination. Consider the pyramids at Giza, monuments not merely to power, but to continuity. When Khufu commissioned the Great Pyramid around 2600 BCE, it was not built in haste or vanity. It was constructed with a solemn understanding that death was not an end, but a doorway. For the Egyptians, the afterlife was not myth, it was destiny. They believed that the soul journeyed beyond this world, that the heart would be weighed against a feather, the feather of truth. If the heart was heavy with wrongdoing, it would be devoured. But if balanced, the soul would pass into eternal fields of peace. So they prepared. They preserved bodies through mummification. They filled tombs with food, tools, and sacred texts. They inscribed prayers along stone walls, hoping that words themselves could grant immortality. And yet Egypt's greatness was not built only in tombs. It was built in the rhythm of daily life. Farmers bending beneath the sun, artisans carving hieroglyphs into temple walls, scribes trained in literacy recording harvests and laws, women who could own property and initiate divorce, a measure of social agency rare in the ancient world. This was a civilization of remarkable complexity and innovation. They developed a calendar based on the stars. They practiced medicine with surprising sophistication. They engineered irrigation systems that transformed desert into farmland. But history, like the Nile, does not flow in a straight line. Egypt knew glory, and it knew fracture. The old kingdom, age of pyramid builders, eventually faltered. Power fragmented. Famine and instability followed. Yet from disorder rose renewal. The Middle Kingdom restored unity and expanded trade deep into Africa and the Near East. And then came the New Kingdom, the empire at its zenith. Under rulers like Hatshepsut, Egypt saw prosperity and ambitious architectural achievement. She, a woman in a world of kings, ruled with authority and vision, sending expeditions to distant lands and commissioning grand temples. Later, the warrior king Ramesses II, known to many as Ramses the Great, would project Egyptian power across borders, clashing with the Hittites and erecting colossal statues that proclaimed his might. And there was Akhenaten, the heretic king, who dared to disrupt centuries of tradition by elevating a single god above all others. His revolution was bold, brief, and ultimately reversed, but it revealed something profound. Even in a civilization built on permanence, change was possible. At the heart of Egypt's story is this tension between eternity and transformation. For 3,000 years, dynasties rose and fell. Foreign powers invaded: the Hyksos, the Assyrians, the Persians. Eventually, Egypt would be conquered by Alexander the Great in 332 BCE, and later absorbed into the vast machinery of the Roman Empire. And yet, though empires claimed its territory, none erased its spirit. Walk today among the ruins of Karnak or Luxor Temple, stand before the silent gaze of the Sphinx. There is a stillness there that feels older than memory itself. You begin to understand that Egypt's true empire was not measured only in land or armies. It was measured in time. It endured because it answered the deepest human questions. Who are we? What happens when we die? How do we bring order to a chaotic world? The Egyptians answered not with abstract philosophy, but with stone, ritual, art, and law. They built their faith into the landscape. They turned belief into architecture. And perhaps that is why their civilization still speaks to us. Because beneath the gold and the granite, beneath the myths and monuments, Egypt was a human story. A story of farmers watching the river rise with anxious hope, of mothers teaching children the names of gods, of rulers striving, sometimes wisely, sometimes arrogantly, to hold together a fragile unity. It was a story of resilience. The Nile still flows. The desert wind still sweeps across the pyramids. And though the voices of ancient Egypt have long since faded into silence, their vision endures, etched into stone, whispered in hieroglyphs, carried forward in the very idea that civilization can strive toward order, beauty, and meaning. Egypt's ancient empire was not simply a chapter in history. It was one of humanity's first declarations that we are more than wanderers on the earth. We are builders. We are believers. We are seekers of eternity. Long before there were borders, before there were nations carved by treaties or wars, there was a river that moved with quiet certainty through the desert. The Nile did not rush like a conqueror. It did not roar like a storm. It flowed with patience, rising and falling in a rhythm so dependable that human life could begin to trust it. In a land where the surrounding sands offered little mercy, the Nile beak aimed the difference between survival and extinction, between wandering and belonging. Each year, sometime in the heat of summer, the waters swelled. Fed by distant rains in the Ethiopian highlands, the river overflowed its banks and spread across the floodplain. For weeks, the fields disappeared beneath a shimmering sheet of brown water. To an outsider, it might have looked like disaster. To the ancient Egyptians, it was promise. When the flood receded, it left behind a thick layer of dark, fertile silt. That soil, rich and black, gave Egypt its ancient name, Kemet, the Black Land. Against the red desolation of the desert, this narrow band of life stretched like a ribbon of hope. The earliest communities gathered along its edges. They learned to plant emmer wheat and barley in the moist earth. They tended flax for linen. They domesticated cattle and goats. The river provided fish in abundance, papyrus reeds for writing and boats, clay for bricks and pottery. It was not simply a source of water, it was the architect of possibility. Villages formed because the Nile made permanence practical. Agriculture meant surplus, and surplus meant time. Time to build, to plan, to imagine something larger than a single harvest. Over generations, these small settlements began to recognize their shared dependence on the same current. The river was both highway and boundary. Boats carved through its surface, carrying grain, stone, and people from one community to another. Trade flowed north and south with the current and the wind. Communication was easier along water than across desert. Gradually, a cultural unity began to form, shaped by the same floods, the same planting seasons, the same anxious watching of the river's rise. The Nile structured the calendar itself. The Egyptian year revolved around 3 seasons: Akhet, the inundation; Peret, the growing season; and Shemu, the harvest. Saint time was not abstract. It was measured by water levels, by the glint of sunlight on swelling banks, by the anticipation of what the flood would bring. Priests and officials carefully observed the river, using nilometers, stone staircases carved into the banks, to measure its height. Too low, and famine threatened. Too high, and villages could be swept away. Stability required vigilance, coordination, and trust in a system larger than any one farmer. Out of this shared dependence emerged organization. Irrigation channels were dug to guide water into fields more efficiently. Dikes were constructed to manage overflow. Such projects demanded cooperation. They required leadership, planning, and labor on a scale beyond a single household. The river, in this sense, encouraged political unity. It nudged scattered villages toward collective identity. Eventually, this process culminated in the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt under a single ruler, traditionally remembered as Narmer. The river that flowed from south to north became the spine of a kingdom that saw itself as one body. The Nile also shaped Egyptian imagination. In its steady return each year, people saw a reflection of life, death, and rebirth. The fields that seemed drowned in summer returned green and abundant in winter. Crops that were cut down rose again the following season. The river's cycle offered a natural metaphor for renewal, influencing religious beliefs about the afterlife and the eternal journey of the soul. The god Hapi personified the inundation, depicted as a figure bearing offerings symbolizing nourishment and abundance. Gratitude toward the river became woven into ritual and prayer. Geography amplified its importance. To the east and west lay vast deserts, harsh and largely impassable. To the north, the Mediterranean Sea. To the south, cataracts that made navigation difficult. These Natu. Rao barriers protected the Nile Valley from constant invasion during its early centuries. While other regions faced frequent upheaval, Egypt enjoyed relative security. This stability allowed traditions to deepen, institutions to solidify, and monumental projects to be conceived with confidence that tomorrow would resemble today. Stone for temples and tombs traveled along the river's surface. Massive limestone blocks quarried near Tura and granite hauled from Aswan were floated downstream to construction sites. Without the Nile, the Great Pyramids at Giza would have been unimaginable. The river was not only a source of food, it was an engine of engineering. It carried the raw materials of ambition. Daily life unfolded in intimate conversation with the water. Children learned to swim in its shallows. Fishermen cast nets at dawn. Farmers scanned the horizon for signs of the flood's arrival. Women washed clothes along its banks. Scribes recorded harvest yields that depended entirely on its generosity. When the inundation was plentiful, festivals erupted in gratitude. When it failed, prayers intensified and fear crept into every household. The predictability of the Nile fostered a worldview anchored in order. Unlike the erratic rivers of Mesopotamia, which could devastate without warning, the Nile's rhythm was reassuring. This reliability contributed to the Egyptian concept of Ma'at, the principle of balance and harmony that governed both cosmos and society. Just as the river followed its appointed course, so too should rulers govern justly and citizens live ethically. Nature itself seemed to endorse stability. Trade routes extended beyond the valley because the river enabled surplus production. Grain could be stored and transported. Egypt became a breadbasket exporting food to neighboring regions. In return came cedar wood from Lebanon, incense from Punt, copper fro, Simeni. The Nile connected Egypt internally and positioned it externally as a participant in a broader ancient world. Even in times of political fragmentation, the river remained constant. Dynasties rose and fell along its banks, but the inundation returned. It witnessed triumphs and crises without altering its course. Its presence softened the uncertainty of human affairs. To live in Egypt was to live within a system sustained by water and sun, by a delicate but dependable ecological balance. The desert, ever watchful at the edges, reinforced appreciation for this narrow corridor of life. Step beyond the cultivated fields and the sand swallowed footprints within hours. The contrast sharpened awareness of the Nile's gift. It was not merely a river. It was a lifeline threading through an otherwise unforgiving landscape. Every temple, every village, every field of grain testified to its quiet authority. In the hush before dawn, when mist hovered over the surface and the first birds stirred among the reeds, the Nile carried with it the accumulated memory of centuries. It had seen hunters become farmers, farmers become builders, builders become kings. It had nourished the hands that carved hieroglyphs and the minds that charted stars. It had shaped the contours of belief and the architecture of power. The river moved steadily northward, bearing boats laden with harvest and stone, reflecting sunlight by day and constellations by night, sustaining a civilization that understood, perhaps more clearly than any other, that its greatness began with water flowing through desert silence, in the stillness before sunrise when the Nile lay quiet beneath a pale sky. There was a presence in Egypt more powerful than the river itself. It was not merely a man seated on a throne. It was an idea that the universe required balance, and that balance depended upon a single human life. The pharaoh was not simply a ruler of land and people. He was the living bridge between heaven and earth, the guardian of Ma'at, the sacred order that held chaos at bay. To understand ancient Egypt, one must first understand this profound conviction. The cosmos was fragile. Beyond the fertile valley stretched the red desert, a realm associated with disorder and danger. Beyond the night sky lurked uncertainty. Without constant vigilance, chaos, Isfet, could overwhelm harmony. The pharaoh stood at the center of this tension. His duty was not only political administration, but cosmic stewardship. If he ruled justly, the Nile would rise properly, the crops would flourish, the gods would remain favorable. If he failed, the entire world could tilt toward ruin. From the earliest dynasties, the king was regarded as divine. Tradition recalls the unifier Narmer, as both conqueror and sacred sovereign, wearing the crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt to symbolize unity. That double crown was more than ornament. It was theology rendered in fabric and stone. It declared that the land was whole because the ruler embodied that wholeness. The pharaoh was believed to be the earthly manifestation of Horus, the falcon god of kingship. Upon death, he became associated with Osiris, lord of the afterlife, while his successor assumed the mantle of Horus anew. Kingship was thus a divine cycle, mirroring the rhythms of nature itself. The throne did not merely pass from father to son. It was renewed as part of a cosmic pattern that stretched back to the dawn of time. Ceremony reinforced belief. In temples rising along the Nile, priests performed daily rituals not for the public, but on behalf of the king. Offerings of bread, beer, incense, and linen were presented to statues of the gods, ensuring their continued favor. Though the pharaoh might not be physically present in every sanctuary, He was symbolically at the center of each rite. In inscriptions, it was always the king who offered to the gods, the king who built the temple, the king who restored balance. The concept of Ma'at was both moral and structural. It meant truth, justice, harmony, equilibrium. It was represented as a goddess with a single ostrich feather upon her head. In the afterlife, hearts were weighed against that feather to determine worthiness. In life, the pharaoh was charged with upholding Ma'at through fair judgment, proper taxation, maintenance of irrigation systems, defense against enemies, and reverence toward tradition. Governance was sacred duty. When a new king ascended, elaborate coronation rituals affirmed his divine status. He was given 5 royal names, each linking him to cosmic forces and ancestral legitimacy. These titles proclaimed him King of Upper and Lower Egypt, Son of Ra, and other epithets that wove his identity into the fabric of heaven and earth. The sun god Ra, whose daily journey across the sky symbolized renewal, became closely associated with kingship. Particularly during the Old Kingdom, pharaohs built sun temples and aligned pyramids with celestial events, embedding astronomy into architecture. The construction of monumental tombs reflected this theology of power. The Great Pyramid commissioned by Khufu was not merely a display of wealth or ambition. It was a statement about divine permanence. Its precise alignment with the cardinal points and its immense scale suggested that the king's authority extended beyond death into eternity. Laborers who hauled limestone blocks were not slaves in chains, as later myths imagined, but organized workers participating in a sacred enterprise. Their efforts sustained the divine order embodied in the pharaoh. Yet divine kingship was not immune to challenge. At times, strong personalities reshaped the boundary of belief. In the 14th century BCE, Akhenaten disrupted centuries of tradition by elevating the Aten, the disk of the sun, above all other gods. He moved the capital to a new city and attempted to redirect worship toward a singular divine focus. In doing so, he altered the delicate balance between king, priesthood, and populace. His revolution revealed that even sacred institutions could be strained by human will. After his death, traditional worship was restored and his name was chiseled from monuments, an attempt to erase the memory of imbalance. Other rulers embodied the ideal more seamlessly. Hatshepsut, who assumed the full regalia of kingship despite being a woman in a predominantly male line of rulers, presented herself as chosen by the god Amun. Reliefs depicted her divine birth, legitimizing her authority through sacred narrative. She commissioned magnificent temples and prosperous trade expeditions, demonstrating that Ma'at could be maintained through diplomacy and construction as much as through warfare. Then there was Ramesses II, whose reign projected confidence and grandeur. His colossal statues towered over temple entrances, his cartouches carved deep into stone across the land. He fought at the Battle of Kadesh and later signed one of history's earliest recorded peace treaties. Through victory negotiation and monumental building, he portrayed himself as the ultimate guardian of order, the strong arm defending Egypt against chaos beyond its borders. The relationship between pharaoh and people was complex. To common farmers, the king might seem distant, glimpsed only in festival processions or through carved images on temple walls. Yet his presence was felt in taxation systems, in irrigation maintenance, and legal judgments. Officials acted in his name, scribes recorded in his authority, soldiers marched under his banner. The state was an extensio. Of divine will. When famine struck or foreign invasion loomed, questions about the king's ability to uphold Ma'at grew sharper. Periods of political fragmentation, such as the First Intermediate Period, were later remembered as times when order faltered and the balance between gods and men weakened. Restoration of strong central rule was celebrated not merely as political recovery, but as cosmic repair. Divine kingship infused daily life with meaning. Every harvest, every flood of the Nile, every temple festival reinforced the conviction that harmony required stewardship. The pharaoh stood at the apex of this system, both symbol and instrument of continuity. His body was adorned with regalia heavy with symbolism, the crook and flail signifying shepherd and provider, the false beard linking him to divine ancestors, the uraeus serpent poised upon his brow as a sign of protective power. In this vision of governance, politics, and spirituality were inseparable. The throne was altar, and the altar was throne. Justice in the courtroom echoed in the heavens. Architecture became theology in stone. The king's heartbeat was imagined as synchronized with the pulse of the universe, sustaining the fragile equilibrium between fertile valley and encroaching desert, between mortal life and eternal horizon, between the visible world of fields and temples and the unseen realm where gods watched and waited for harmony to be upheld day after day beneath the unblinking Egyptian sun. Across the western horizon of the Nile Valley, where the sun sinks each evening into a blaze of crimson and gold, the ancient Egyptians chose to build their monuments to eternity. They did not place them randomly. They aligned them with the path of the dying sun, with the cardinal points of the compass, with the stars that never seemed to fade. In stone, they expressed a conviction that death was not disappeared, a rance but transformation, and that memory could be secured against the erosion of time. The pyramids rising from the plateau at Giza are the most visible expression of that belief. Even today, their silhouettes interrupt the desert sky with geometric precision. To stand before them is to feel the weight of intention. These structures were not accidental achievements of brute force. They were carefully calculated statements about power, faith, and permanence. The story of pyramid building begins before Giza in the reign of Djoser. His step pyramid at Saqqara marked a radical departure from earlier mastaba tombs. Designed by his architect Imhotep, it rose in stages, ascending toward the heavens as if testing the possibility that stone itself could climb toward the divine. It was both innovation and declaration. The king's journey after death would be monumental. A century later, ambition found its fullest expression under Khufu. His Great Pyramid, constructed around 2600 BCE, was once encased in polished white limestone that reflected sunlight so brilliantly it must have seemed almost luminous. More than 2 million blocks were arranged with astonishing precision. The structure's alignment with true north is so exact that modern instruments confirm only minimal deviation. Within its chambers and corridors lies a labyrinth designed not merely to conceal a burial, but to facilitate a spiritual ascent. For the Egyptians, architecture was theology rendered in stone. The pyramid's shape mirrored the primordial mound that emerged from chaos at the beginning of creation. It also evoked the rays of the sun descending to earth. The king, as son of Ra, would rise along those symbolic rays to join the solar bark in its eternal voyage across the sky. Each block, each angle, each chamber reflected cosmic symbolism. The labor that produced these monuments has long been misunderstood. Contrary to later legends of mass slavery, archaeological evidence reveals organized communities of workers, skilled artisans, engineers, and laborers who lived in planned settlements near the construction sites. They received rations of bread and beer, medical care, and recognition for their work. Graffiti found within the pyramids bear the names of work gangs, some humorously calling themselves Friends of Khufu. Their participation suggests a collective investment in the king's eternal destiny, and by extension in the stability of the realm. Yet pyramids were not the only monuments of eternity. As centuries passed, architectural forms evolved. In the Middle and New Kingdoms, pharaohs began carving their tombs deep into the cliffs of the Valley of the Kings near Luxor. Concealment replaced visibility, but the theology remained constant. Walls were adorned with elaborate scenes from sacred texts, guiding the deceased through the trials of the afterlife. Every painted figure, every hieroglyph was a safeguard against oblivion. Temples, too, were monuments to continuity. The vast complex at Karnak grew over centuries as successive rulers added pylons, obelisks, and hypostyle halls. Columns carved to resemble papyrus and lotus plants rose like stone forests, their capitals blossoming beneath painted ceilings. These spaces were not designed for congregational worship in the modern sense. They were sacred precincts where priests performed rituals to sustain the gods and, through them, the cosmic order. Colossal statues guarded temple entrances, projecting both reverence and authority. The seated figures of Ramesses II at Abu Simbel stare outward with serene confidence, their scale dwarfing human visitors. They were carved directly into the rock face, merging natural landscape with royal identity. Twice a year, sunlight penetrates the inner sanctuary, illuminating the statues within. A deliberate alignment that fuses architecture with celestial rhythm. Monuments were also inscriptions of memory. Walls became archives, reliefs recorded victories in battle, offerings to gods, genealogies of rulers. Hieroglyphs transformed stone into narrative. In these carvings, the king was perpetually youthful, perpetually victorious, perpetually devout. Art was not meant to capture fleeting reality, but to assert eternal truth. The idealized image ensured that the pharaoh's presence would endure beyond mortality. Even non-royal Egyptians sought a share in permanence. Wealthy officials built elaborate tombs adorned with scenes of daily life, fishing in the marshes, overseeing harvests, enjoying banquets. These images were not decoration alone. They were believed to sustain the deceased in the next world. By depicting abundance, they hoped to guarantee it. Monumentality filtered downward, reflecting a society deeply invested in remembrance. The materials themselves carried symbolism. Granite from Aswan conveyed durability. Limestone suggested purity. Gold, considered the flesh of the gods, adorned sarcophagi and burial goods. The famous tomb of Tutankhamun, though modest in scale compared to earlier royal burials, revealed a treasury of objects crafted with exquisite care: chariots, jewelry, ceremonial masks, each intended to serve the young king in eternity. Monument building required immense organization. Quarrying expeditions were dispatched to distant regions. Scribes recorded shipments of stone and timber. Engineers devised ramps and levers. The process unified the nation in shared endeavor. It demonstrated the Kappa, city of centralized authority to mobilize resources on a scale unmatched in the ancient world. And yet, beneath the grandeur lay vulnerability. Wind and sand eroded surfaces. Tomb robbers sought treasure. Political upheaval sometimes interrupted construction. Still, the monuments endured. Their survival through millennia of shifting empires testifies to the Egyptians' mastery of both material and meaning. When modern visitors approach the pyramids or walk beneath the towering columns of Karnak, they encounter more than relics. They confront a worldview carved into landscape, a belief that human life, though brief, could be anchored to something eternal. Stone was chosen because it resisted decay. Alignment with stars was chosen because the heavens appeared unchanging. Architecture became a dialogue between mortality and infinity. In the silence of the desert night, when stars shimmer above the plateau and the air cools after the heat of day, the pyramids stand as they have stood for thousands of years. Their angles cut against the sky with unwavering clarity. The wind moves across their surfaces, whispering through ancient seams. Within their chambers, darkness lingers where once priests chanted prayers for ascent. The monuments remain, not as empty shells, but as enduring proclamations that the ancient Egyptians dared to believe time itself could be challenged, that through devotion, engineering, and unyielding faith in the afterlife, they could transform stone into eternity and carve their presence into the very horizon where sun and sand meet without surrendering to the silence that claims all mortal things. There came a time when Egypt no longer looked inward toward the quiet certainty of its river alone, but outward toward horizons filled with rival kingdoms, distant trade routes, and the promise of dominion. The Nile still flowed with familiar rhythm. Temples still echoed with prayers, but beyond the valley new ambitions stirred. The age of empire had arrived, and Egypt would step onto a broader stage beneath rulers who believed their authority extended as far as their chariots could travel. The transformation began after a period of humiliation and recovery. During the Second Intermediate Period, foreign rulers known as the Hyksos established control over parts of northern Egypt. They introduced new technologies, including the horse-drawn chariot and advanced weaponry. Their presence unsettled the old order. Yet from Thebes in the south rose a line of kings determined to restore unity. Among them was Ahmose I, who drove the Hyksos from the land around 1550 BCE and inaugurated the new kingdom. His victory was not merely territorial, it ignited a new philosophy of kingship, one that fused divine authority with military strength. Egypt would no longer rely solely on natural barriers for protection. Its rulers carried war beyond their borders. Campaigns pushed south into Nubia, securing gold mines and trade routes. To the northeast, Egyptian armies marched into the Levant, confronting powerful states that competed for influence. The pharaoh was still guardian of Ma'at, but now he was also commander of disciplined forces equipped with chariots, composite bows, and organized infantry. Under Thutmose III, Egypt reached unprecedented heights of expansion. Often called the Napoleon of Egypt, by later historians, he led numerous campaigns into Syria and Canaan. At the Battle of Megiddo, he demonstrated strategic daring, guiding his troops through a narrow pass to surprise a coalition of rebellious city-states. Victory secured tribute and allegiance. Silver, cedar wood, horses, and exotic goods flowed back to the Nile Valley. Egypt became not just a kingdom, but an empire. Tribute lists carved into temple walls revealed the breadth of influence. Princes from distant lands bowing before the pharaoh, offering gifts in acknowledgement of his supremacy. These images were more than propaganda. They expressed a worldview in which Egypt stood at the center of a cosmic map. Foreign lands existed within a hierarchy, their wealth and loyalty reinforcing the stability of the homeland. Yet empire was not sustained by conquest alone. Diplomacy played a critical role. Royal marriages forged alliances. Letters exchanged between courts preserved in the Amarna archives reveal negotiations over trade, territory, and mutual defense. Gold from Egypt was highly prized, and pharaohs used it as a diplomatic instrument. The empire became a network of relationships as much as a domain of force. In this era, the role of the pharaoh expanded symbolically. Reliefs depicted kings towering over enemies, grasping captives by the hair, smiting them with raised mace. Such scenes, carved in enduring stone, were ritual affirmations of order triumphing over chaos. The battlefield was an extension of cosmic struggle. Each victory reinforced Ma'at, each defeat threatened its balance. Among the most formidable figures of this age was Hatshepsut, who ruled not through relentless warfare but through strategic consolidation and economic expansion. She launched a celebrated expedition to the land of Punt, bringing back incense, ebony, and living myrrh trees planted within temple precincts. Her ray, Igna, demonstrated that empire could be expressed through prosperity and architectural splendor as much as through military might. Temples grew larger, richer, more intricate. The complex at Karnak expanded dramatically during the New Kingdom, reflecting the wealth drawn from foreign territories. Obelisks pierced the sky, their surfaces inscribed with declarations of divine favor and imperial reach. Columns multiplied, halls deepened, sanctuaries became more elaborate. Architecture mirrored ambition. Then came Ramesses II, whose reign symbolized imperial grandeur in its most dramatic form. Early in his rule, he confronted the Hittite Empire at the Battle of Kadesh. Though the encounter ended inconclusively, Egyptian accounts celebrated it as heroic triumph. Scenes carved at Abu Simbel and other temples portray Ramesses charging alone into enemy ranks, his chariot racing forward with fearless resolve. Later, he concluded a peace treaty with the Hittites, one of the earliest recorded in history, transforming rivalry into stability. Empire in this moment matured from conquest into negotiation. The empire's reach brought cultural exchange. Foreign artisans introduced new artistic motifs. Captives were integrated into labor forces. Deities from other regions entered Egyptian religious practice, sometimes merging with local gods. The boundaries between conqueror and conquered blurred in subtle ways. Egypt influenced and was influenced in return. Yet expansion carried burdens. Garrisons had to be maintained. Vassal states required oversight. Resources were stretched across distances that tested administrative capacity. Communication moved along trade routes and desert tracks, but time and terrain could weaken central authority. The very scale that signified greatness also introduced fragility. As generations passed, cracks appeared. External threats intensified, including incursions by groups often identified as the Sea Peoples. Internal divisions strained cohesion. Economic pressures mounted. The empire that had projected power across continents began to contract. Territories once loyal grew restless. Military campaigns yielded diminishing returns. Still, the memory of empire lingered in stone. Colossal statues remained upright. Temple walls continued to proclaim victories. The grandeur of the new kingdom etched itself into collective consciousness. Even as political dominance waned, cultural influence endured. In this age, Egypt redefined itself. It was no longer a civilization defined solely by the rhythms of the Nile, protected by desert isolation. It was a participant in a competitive international arena. Its rulers balanced sword and scepter, diplomacy and devotion. Empire became both opportunity and trial, a testament to ambition and a reminder of impermanence. The age of empire revealed a civilization confident enough to project its power beyond natural borders, bold enough to confront rivals on distant plains, and wealthy enough to transform foreign tribute into temples that shimmered beneath the sun. Chariots thundered across battlefields, envoys crossed deserts bearing gold and letters sealed with royal names. And in the heart of it all stood the pharaoh, warrior, diplomat, embodiment of divine order, seeking to extend the harmony of the Nile into lands where its waters did not flow. Carrying the weight of expansion upon shoulders adorned with crowns that symbolized unity even as the horizon widened with both promise and peril. Empires rise with banners unfurled and armies in motion, but they rarely imagine the day when their own standards will bow before another power. Egypt, which had once projected its authority deep into Nubia and the Levant, eventually found itself confronting the slow erosion of dominance. Yet what is? Remarkable about Egypt is not simply that it was conquered, but that it endured. Its language, religion, art, and memory threading themselves into the fabric of every civilization that followed. After the splendor of the new kingdom faded, the Nile Valley entered periods of division and vulnerability. Libyan dynasts ruled portions of the land. Nubian kings from Kush ascended the throne, embracing Egyptian traditions even as they brought their own cultural influences. Assyrian armies marched south, demonstrating the shifting balance of power in the Near East. Each wave of conquest altered the political landscape, yet none erased the underlying identity shaped over millennia along the Nile. In 525 BCE, the Persian king Cambyses II defeated Egypt and incorporated it into the vast Achaemenid Empire. Persian rule introduced new administrative structures and connected Egypt more directly to a transcontinental network stretching from Anatolia to the Indus Valley. Yet even under foreign governance, Egyptian temples continued to function, priests maintained rituals, and hieroglyphs were carved upon stone. Conquerors often found it prudent to present themselves as legitimate pharaohs, adopting traditional titles and participating in sacred ceremonies to secure loyalty. The most dramatic transformation came with the arrival of Alexander the Great in 332 BCE. When his forces entered Egypt, he was welcomed not as an oppressor but as a liberator from Persian control. He visited the oracle at Siwa, where he was proclaimed son of the god Ammon, a declaration that linked him symbolically to the ancient line of divine kings. In that moment, Greek ambition intertwined with Egyptian theology. After Alexander's death, his general Ptolemy assumed control, founding the Ptolemaic dynasty. Greek rulers now sat upon the throne of the pharaohs, yet they adopted Egyptian regalia and participate in age-old rituals. The city of Alexandria blossomed into a beacon of Hellenistic culture, home to the great library and a crossroads of intellectual exchange. Greek language and philosophy flourished, but so did the worship of traditional gods. The fusion produced new forms, such as the deity Serapis, blending Greek and Egyptian elements into a shared religious symbol. Art and architecture reflected this synthesis. Temples built during the Ptolemaic era, like those at Edfu and Philae, adhered to ancient Egyptian design while bearing inscriptions in both hieroglyphic and Greek scripts. Columns still rose like bundled papyrus stalks. Reliefs still depicted offerings to Horus and Isis. The old forms persisted, proving adaptable rather than fragile. The final chapter of independent Egyptian rule is inseparable from Cleopatra VII. Fluent in multiple languages and adept in political maneuvering, she sought to preserve her kingdom's sovereignty amid the rising power of Rome. Her alliances with Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony were strategic attempts to secure Egypt's autonomy. Yet after defeat at the Battle of Actium, Egypt fell under Roman control in 30 BCE, becoming a province of the expanding Roman Empire. Under Rome, Egypt became a crucial source of grain, feeding the population of the imperial capital. Roman emperors adopted pharaonic imagery in temple reliefs, presenting themselves in traditional poses despite governing from afar. The machinery of empire changed, but the symbols of continuity remained visible along the Nile. Over time, new faiths reshaped the spiritual landscape. Christianity spread through Egypt, and later Islam transformed the region's cultural and religious identity. Temples were repurposed, hieroglyphic knowledge faded, and ancient rituals ceased, yet the monuments endured. Pyramids stood against desert winds. Obelisks, some transported to Rome and later to cities across Europe, became emblems of timeless authority. The very stones of Egypt traveled, carrying echoes of their origin into distant capitals. Centuries passed before scholars deciphered the hieroglyphic script. The discovery of the Rosetta Stone in 1799, bearing inscriptions in Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphic, allowed Jean-François Champollion to unlock the language of the pharaohs. With translation came renewed understanding. Names long silent, Ramesses, Hatshepsut, Tutmosa, resurfaced from carved surfaces. Tombs yielded treasures and texts illuminating beliefs about life, death, and divine order. Egypt's influence extended far beyond its borders. Greek philosophers admired its antiquity and wisdom. Roman architects borrowed motifs. Renaissance thinkers marveled at obelisks and hieroglyphs, weaving Egyptian symbolism into art and literature. In the modern era, discoveries in the Valley of the Kings captivated global imagination, especially the unearthing of the tomb of Tutankhamun in 1922, which revealed a trove of gold and craftsmanship that seemed untouched by time. The endurance of Egypt's legacy lies not only in stone, but in concept. The idea of divine kingship influenced neighboring civilizations. The calendar based on solar observation informed later systems of timekeeping. Techniques in architecture and engineering set precedents for monumental construction. Artistic conventions emphasizing order and proportion resonated through centuries. Even the image of the pyramid became universal, symbolizing mystery, endurance, and human aspiration. Travelers across eras approached the Giza plateau with awe, recording impressions that mingled scholarship with wonder. Empires that conquered Egypt found themselves humbled by the scale of what had come before. the conqueror became caretaker of antiquity. What distinguishes Egypt's legacy is its capacity to be absorbed without being erased. Each foreign power layered its identity upon the Nile Valley, yet beneath those layers the ancient foundation persisted. Cultural memory proved more resilient than political sovereignty. Rituals adapted, language evolved, but the imprint of early civilization remained discernible. The desert preserved what time might otherwise have destroyed. Dry air shielded tomb paintings, sand-covered temples protecting them from complete ruin. When uncovered centuries later, these relics spoke across millennia, revealing a civilization deeply invested in continuity. Today, the influence of Egypt appears in museums, textbooks, films, and scholarly debates. Archaeologists continue to unearth artifacts that refine understanding. Tourists walk corridors carved for kings long gone. The Nile still flows past Cairo, past Luxor, past Aswan, carrying reflections of minarets and modern bridges alongside the memory of ancient pylons. Egypt's empire as a political force faded, but its cultural gravity endured. It shaped conquerors as much as conquerors shaped it. From Macedonian generals to Roman emperors, from medieval chroniclers to modern historians, generations have grappled with its antiquity and achievement. The stones remain, inscriptions weathered yet legible, statues gazing outward with unblinking calm, as if aware that kingdoms may rise and fall, but the imprint of belief, artistry, and human striving carved into desert rock can outlast the ambitions of those who once claimed dominion over the fertile ribbon of the Nile Valley. Thanks for watching this video, and don't forget to like and subscribe.